Thank you to everyone who's joined us today, and welcome to this Institute for European Environmental Policy webinar, addressing the question of can the UK feasibly reach World Health Organization targets from a devolved nations perspective? So today's webinar will be an hour and a half in length, and the IEEP will be uploading a full recording of the webinar to their YouTube channel afterwards. So we're going to hear some presentations today from a number of speakers about action and inaction on air pollution in the UK's devolved nations and other regions. We'll also hear about the opportunities and challenges of UK-EU divergence on air quality and the potential for the UK to meet the World Health Organization's air quality standards. There will then be plenty of opportunity to put questions to our panel after the presentations. And I think you've already seen in the chat that there's a questions function. If you do want to add your questions as we're going along, please put them in the questions box, and then they can be correctly found and attributed to the right people. So I should say my name's Livi Elsmore. I work for the Healthy Air Coalition here in the UK as Senior Campaign Manager. And the Healthy Air Coalition is a broad coalition of about 40 organisations campaigning on air pollution in the UK, particularly campaigning to push the UK government to take stronger action on air pollution in Westminster for the benefit of people living in England and across the UK. There are also brilliant campaigners and experts pushing for clean air in each of the UK's devolved parliaments and assemblies, and we're going to hear from some of those today. So without further ado, I'll introduce you to our presenters and panelists. Today we have Christopher Crompton and Chiara Antonelli from the IEEP. We have Professor Paul Lewis from the University of Swansea and UKRI Clean Air Champion for Wales. He's also chair of the Welsh Government's Clean Air Advisory Panel. We have Dr. Neil Rowland from Queen's University Business School and UKRI Clean Air Champion for Northern Ireland. We have Gareth Brown, Policy Lead for Asthma along the UK and Scotland and Chair of Healthy Air Scotland. And last but not least, we have Matt Browning, who is Principal Policy and Programme Officer at the Greater London Authority, working on all things air pollution. So I think that leaves first thing on the agenda to go to our first presentation, which will be from Christopher from the Institute for European Environmental Policy. Christopher, I will hand over to you. I think you might be on mute, Christopher. That's our first hiccup of the day.
Great, thank you. Hopefully you can hear me now. Thanks very much. And an overview, thank you first of all to you, Livi, for chairing for us. And thanks to all our panelists for giving their time. And thanks to everyone who's turned up to attend. I think we'll have a really interesting discussion today. Ed, if we can skip to the next slide, please. I just want to give a bit of an overview as a way of introduction and background just on the state of play, where we're at the moment in the UK on air quality and how we're doing compared to the EU. This is something that at IEEP UK we put out a report on at the end of last year in December, tracking that divergence post-Brexit from EU policy. And there's been a lot of progress both in the UK and the EU in the last few decades. But Brexit was presented as this opportunity to claw back legislative freedom from the EU. But with power, of course, comes responsibility to the environment and to the health of our citizens. And so this report is really looking at the state of play. And there have been divergences in some areas. And we've looked at the headline legislative changes, but also at some of the sectoral progress across industry, land, agriculture, nature and transport and energy, and a little bit of indoor air quality too. In terms of the headline legislation, the EU changed its ambient air quality directive in 2024, and that update merged the two former directives into one. And the ultimate objective there is to reach zero pollution to air by 2050. And there are some strict limit values along the way to that. And there are some qualitative changes as well. And they can be a little bit harder to directly compare than the quantitative limit values, but they're important too. And we're looking at things like access to justice and damage redress, better public information, requirements for air quality plans. And over here in the UK, we've got air quality standards regulations from back in 2010, which were implementing the former directives from the EU. And they apply mostly in England, but there are provisions on PM 2.5 and transboundary pollution that apply to the devolved nations too. And that's the last real attempt to update the UK air quality standards as a whole. And the changes since that have been more piecemeal. If we can go to the next slide, Ed. This is a set of tables from our report, and it's really comparing where we are in the UK with the EU and with the World Health Organization, which you'll see on the far left there. Sorry if some of these are coming up a bit small, but I'll draw out a few highlights. On PM 2.5, the fine particulate matter, Scotland set a limit of 10 micrograms annually by 2030, which is in line with the EU. It says here that England and Wales has that 10 microgram target for 2040. In fact, just after we put out our report, the EIP, the Environmental Improvement Plan, moved that forward to 2030. But this is still double what the WHO is recommending for those limit values. On PM10, again, UK 40 microgram limit, which has been in place from back in 2010. That's more than double the current EU 2030 target. But this is a great example of how the devolved administrations can take the charge, because Scotland's got a new 80 microgram limit, which is more stringent than the EU, and it's pretty close to where the WHO is setting its own recommendation of 15 micrograms. And then on NO2, again, in the UK, we've got a limit value set from 2010, which is double the current EU limit. No revisions from devolved nations or otherwise. But we're not doing as badly as it might seem by looking at that headline figure, because there's been a consistent long-term decline in NO2. The average concentrations in urban background sites has dropped to the lowest on record in 2024. We're still averaging above 22 micrograms next to roadsides, but there are some triumphs there as well, particularly in London, which I'm sure we'll come back to from Matt a little bit later in the talks. I'm not going to go into details on all of these, but I will note that if you look at benzene, this is a good example of where the UK overall limit value is behind the EU. But again, Scotland and Northern Ireland, they've improved upon that. They've drawn ahead of the EU. Note as well that benzene is not covered by the WHO in terms of its limit value recommendations, which brings me to the next slide, Ed. Thank you. Why are we talking about the WHO? All of us who are interested in air quality policy, we talk about the WHO all the time as the sort of gold standard, that we should all be aspiring to these levels of limit values, which is why I've made this webinar about this and about the feasibility of getting there. It's worth mentioning quickly a few caveats. First of all, the WHO is only really talking about 6 key pollutants, and they're very important. They're the ones that are most critical for human health, the ones we've got the most robust evidence on regarding the health effects, but they're only concerned with human health. So we're not talking here about the effects on ecosystems from air pollutants. We're not talking about the effects on vegetation, biodiversity, or pollution in other areas like water and soil. And we're only also talking about ambient air quality, so we're not talking about indoor air quality, which is something that's increasingly drawing attention. And then, of course, even the WHO targets, they're only a stepping stone. We see a picture whereby the UK has to sort of keep track of and try and align with the EU standards, but then the EU standards are only a stepping stone towards WHO alignment, and then even that in itself is only a stepping stone towards the ultimate target of no pollution to air, which is actually what the EU themselves are aspiring to. Final slide, please, Ed. Quick final thoughts before I pass on to our excellent colleague and then to our panelists. At risk of sounding like a politician, I wanted this webinar to be positive, to be pragmatic, to be proactive. Yes, we've fallen behind the EU in some areas, but the devolved powers are leading, both in the UK and the EU in some areas. So acknowledging that there are differences between the regions and the nations, and we've got different contextual challenges in terms of the problems we've got to tackle and the public and the political attitudes. It feels important that we've got this open discussion that we can have about the practicalities and about the examples we can set for one another and about the lessons we can learn from one another. So I really look forward to a very fruitful discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Christopher. That was excellent. If any of Christopher's contributions are inspiring any thoughts and questions, please do pop them in the question box. And next, I'm going to be introducing Christopher's colleague, Chiara Antonelli, who's going to talk a little bit about EU progress and the potential for meeting the World Health Organization standards. Chiara, over to you.
Thank you very much, Livi, and good afternoon, everybody. And also thank you for the invitation to this webinar. I'm from IEEP so let's say the sister organization of IEEP UK, which is set in Brussels. So what I'm going to give today is a short overview of where the EU stands on air quality. Of course, there's this thorough report that Christopher has already published and presented shortly before, but I'll just bring some reflections of what this might mean for the UK as it reflects on its own pathway, of course. So let me start with a simple framing. Quality in Europe and the EU has historically sat between two poles. On one side, we have the science-based recommendation of the WHO, and on the other, we know what is politically and economically feasible across the member states. And while this the WHO reports periodically updated, let's say that this gap has been quite large. Under the previous ambient air quality directive, EU limits values for some key pollutants, for instance, nitrous dioxide or PM2.5. They were 3 to 5 times higher than what WHO would inform and advise in these guidelines levels. So there is this dichotomy, let's say. We know that EU standards were and are legally binding and therefore powerful in that way. But at the same time, they were not fully aligned with what we know is best for health, which is what WHO guidelines are actually recommending. But that has changed and quite significantly in the recent revision of that directive. There's more background, of course, that Chris has given to that, and you can also find that in the report. But just to give an example, the PM2, the particular matter 2.5 levels has been reduced to 25 to 10 micrograms per cubic meter, and nitrogen dioxide respectively from 40 to 20. So that's been quite, let's say, in this case, halving, or in the case of PM2.5, more than halving the levels in the EU, in the new EU AAQT. Of course, this doesn't bring the EU fully in line with the WHO guidelines. As Christopher mentioned before, they're a bit stricter than that. Those remain more stringent, but it still cuts the gap roughly in half. So the key message here is that the EU has moved from a position to divergence to one of partial convergence with WHO standard. I would argue, though, that the most important shift is not just in the numbers. Here is the direction of travel. The revised directive introduces a mechanism, in fact, for regular review, and that means that EU standards are now expected to evolve in line with the latest scientific evidence that WHO, of course, also reports. This means that, in other words, alignment with WHO now is no longer a one-off political question as we could consider before. In the EU now, it becomes a dynamic process. There is also something that the EU, with this new AAQT, but also the upcoming air quality policies that we are cooking, let's say, that there is something that WHO guidelines right now cannot bring, which is, of course, enforceability. So EU limit values are legally binding. So we are in a directive. Of course, there are still some, as EU directive works, of course, there is some sort of flexibility, of course, for member states to transpose such directive and develop their air quality plans. But all in all, this directive comes with monitoring obligations, the member state quality plans, also increasingly provisions and access to justice, very relevant for us, and compensation. So even if the standards are still less strict than WHO's targets, there are embedded in governance systems that can actually drive the change that we're hoping for on the ground. So of course, the EU approach still reflects on compromise. We know we talked about feasibility before. There are some flexibilities that have been negotiated, so including possible delays under specific conditions. And the final targets, of course, as we said before, stop short of full WHO alignment. So this is where I think there are some useful reflections also for the UK. So first, the EU experience now shows that this convergence towards WHO standard is possible, but of course is typically gradual. The second point is, of course, binding targets matter. This creates accountability. It creates a long-term political and policy certainty, even if they're not perfect from a health perspective or still not there yet. A third, perhaps most relevant for today's discussion, is also that progress does not have to be uniform. So today we're going to hear some discussions and points also from different parts of UK. I'm looking forward to hearing from the other panelists. But even especially within the EU, we know that there are different member states. And within the member states, there are different regions and even cities that move at different speeds, often going beyond minimum requirements, luckily. So this may resonate with the role of devolved governments in the UK, where we still know that there is scope for leadership and in experimentation. So just to conclude, the EU is not yet at the WHO levels, but it is now firmly on a trajectory towards them. So this combines significant scientific reference points and with legal enforceability, and also increasingly with a mechanism for continuous tightening. So for the UK, I suppose the question may not simply be whether to align with EU or WHO, but it's more on how to design a system that, for instance, like the EU's, can progressively close this gap with the guidelines over time while remaining credible, so enforceable, and as such deliverable. And that would be from me for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Excellent. So, of course, this webinar has a focus on the perspectives of the UK devolved nations. So for the rest of our panelists, we're now going to go to some overview thoughts from each of those devolved nations. I think each talking for around 7 to 8 minutes each. So first of all, we have Professor Paul Lewis from the University of Swansea, and the UKRI Regional Clean Air Champion for Wales. Professor Paul Lewis, it's over to you.
Thank you very much, Livi, and good afternoon, everyone. And thank you to Christopher and the team for the invitation to speak today. And I'm really looking forward to the discussion that follows. Okay, so we've just had a nice quick overview of both the World Health Organization guidelines and relevance to health, as well as the EU directive from Christopher and Chiara. But air quality is, of course, devolved in the UK, and Wales is one of those devolved nations. And we know that as countries, we're not all working to a single approach, and that we're starting to see different pathways, as mentioned, develop across the nations. And I think it's been like that for some time as well. It's not a new thing. So the next few minutes, I'm going to talk about what we've been doing in Wales on setting the new air quality targets and how they compare with the World Health Organization guidelines, as well as the EU's revised ambient air quality directive. And I quite like the word that Chiara just used, which is experimentation. And maybe Wales could be thought of as an experiment in setting new targets. Because as you've seen in a sec, we're probably a guinea pig in going first. But just say over the last few years, I've been chairing the Welsh Government's Clean Air Advisory Panel, which has been directly involved in providing scientific advice and evidence that has underpinned new legislation I'm going to talk about. So I can kind of reflect on the experience that we've had of going through the legislative process and the pains that go with that as well. But in terms of, just say actually that on our panel, we're not just a collection of experts and government quangos, etc. There is representation there from Healthy Air Cymru, for instance, which is very similar to Healthy Air Coalition as well. And there's representation from organisations like Asthma Lung UK, British Heart Foundation as well. So it's not just the academics who have contributed to the new legislation development in Wales. It has been a lot more open than that. But in terms of introducing new legally binding air pollutant targets, Wales is probably slightly ahead of the rest of the UK, as we have introduced a statutory framework under the Environment, Air Quality and Soundscapes Wales Act, which came into force about 2 years ago. I think it was March 2024. And amongst other things, that act does require that Welsh ministers set targets for, firstly, PM 2.5, but also at least one other additional pollutant, and that could be any one of NO2, ozone, PM10, SO2, carbon monoxide, but also ammonia as well. And ammonia, of course, isn't a pollutant that's listed by either the World Health Organization or the EU. And an area then where Wales, we might differ to other parts of the UK in terms of what we focus on and set targets for. The Act also requires that ministers must have regard to the most recent World Health Organization guidelines in setting their targets as well. So that's set in law, and this is an important caveat as well, they must also ensure that any targets set are achievable within the time frame. And another important commitment for ministers, which again follows the EU's approach, is that there has to be a 5-year review cycle for the targets set. But then with the review process every 5 years, it does mean that Wales could initially set a target for a pollutant above the World Health Organization guideline. But then as situations change, we could amend that then. We could amend that target and push further towards the guideline. And if you're familiar with the Environment Act, you know that we haven't set a PM 2.5 target of 5 microns per cubic meter yet. But let me give you that example, right? Because what we've done with PM 2.5, PM 2.5 was the first pollutant to move through this process following the introduction of the Act. So PM 2.5, Welsh Government has introduced a twin track approach, which sets not just an annual mean target, it also sets a population exposure reduction target as well, known as a PERT. Some of you might be familiar with this from the EU, but also England as well. And this PERT is similar to the EU's average exposure indicator. But the proposed annual mean target, like I said, that's currently set at 10 microns per cubic meter to be achieved by 2035, might not sound that ambitious to a lot of people. But the PERT, or population exposure reduction target, which is going to run alongside that, they've set that as a 25% reduction, and that's also to be achieved by 2035 as well. So if you consider what both of these mean in relation to the WHO guidelines, that PM 2.5 annual target of 10 is currently double the World Health Organization guideline, because comprehensive modelling and extensive independent review over the last few years did indicate that achieving 5 microns per cubic meter across large parts of Wales wasn't feasible immediately. And there's a number of reasons for this as well. One is that PM 2.5 is a regional pollutant, so concentrations are influenced not only by sources within Wales, but also by emissions from elsewhere in the UK and beyond, including northern industrial regions of Europe. We know, for instance, there's still gas-powered, coal-powered fired power stations in Poland. When the wind blows from the east, PM 2.5 comes across, hits the UK, hits Wales as well. And this places some limits on what can be achieved through devolved action alone, as we have no control of the emissions in those countries. And that transboundary effect does contribute quite a large percentage of PM 2.5 in Wales, according to modelling. Another challenge, that a significant proportion of PM 2.5 emissions now comes from sources like domestic combustion, so just think wood burning, commercial cooking in urban areas, restaurants, takeaways, etc., and agriculture, as well as the traditional sources of transport and industry. And these are areas where change is more complex and will take time to happen. But what the World Health Organization does allow is for interim targets to be set, and for PM 2.5, 10 microns per cubic meter is actually one of the interim targets. In fact, it's the lowest interim target. So with a review process allowed every 5 years in Wales, this figure then could actually, like I said earlier, be revised in 2030 and pushed forward towards the WHO guideline. So it does have that flexibility in our legislation. But I think for me, the most important pathway to the WHO guideline in Wales is the population exposure reduction target is PERT. Yes, the annual mean is providing a baseline level of protection, but on its own, it's limited. And once that target is met, there's always that risk that efforts to keep improving air quality across Wales will then just stop. But the PERT says you have to reduce PM 2.5 levels everywhere across Wales by 25% initially, regardless of what the annual mean is. So that could then mean that many areas across Wales do start to meet the WHO guideline in terms of exposure, and then continue to see exposure reduced even further as the years go by. And I think that's really the function of this approach. It avoids the system stalling, if you like, on an interim target, or once an interim target is reached, and then keeps the movement going towards WHO guideline levels over time rather than that one-off compliance. So that's the process for PM 2.5. But as I mentioned, just quickly, the Act also requires at least one other pollutant target, and advice is ongoing as to what pollutants will have targets set for it in law and what the achievable targets could be. I mentioned ammonia as one of those, and this is an example where we don't follow the EU directive or have WHO guidelines to consider. And we have a particular problem with ammonia in Wales. We're a very rural country, where the issue is closely, obviously, then linked to agriculture for both ecological implications, but also air quality as well. But one of the issues that leads to the formation of secondary PM 2.5, and that we've seen through modelling is impacting on health in some very deprived areas in Wales, especially in the valleys in South Wales. So maybe the target setting work we're currently doing in Wales for this pollutant could actually provide new guidelines that could be adapted for other countries going forward, maybe not just in the UK. So just to finish off then, I think in terms of feasibility, the experience from Wales suggests that a pathway toward WHO guideline levels can be built and introduced, but I think for us, it's been a staged process, and will be a staged process, which depends on sustained implementation and then review over time. And in terms of EU alignment, we have strongly considered the current EU directive and delivery, initially for PM 2.5, and then we'll consider to do this for the other pollutants as well. So I'll stop there, and thank you.
Thank you, Paul. That's brilliant. Great to hear some more about how the situation is in Wales and how there's that staggered process of reaching towards something that might resemble the World Health Organization guidelines one day. Well, next up we have Dr. Neil Rowland, and Neil is, among other things, UKRI Regional Champion for Clean Air in Northern Ireland. So I'm sure we're all looking forward to hearing how the picture looks in Northern Ireland, and possible opportunities and barriers in Northern Ireland. So over to you, Dr. Neil.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thanks for the invitation to come and speak at this event. So I'm going to give a perspective from Northern Ireland, and it'll differ in many ways from what Professor Lewis has said about Wales. In terms of devolved policy, we're much further behind all the other parts of the UK. We don't yet have our own clean air strategy. I'll say a bit more about that at the end. So we don't have anything really to distinguish ourselves from the sort of legislation that's been in place for a number of years and which isn't really suitable for tackling the challenges that we face today. So what I'm going to just talk about is if the air quality guidelines were to be implemented today, would Northern Ireland meet them? What are the prospects for meeting them in the sort of near term? And what are the sort of challenges, the air quality challenges that are a barrier to improving air quality in the region? Next slide, please. So I'm going to focus first of all on the latest monitoring data, which comes from a 2024 report published by DERA, who is the Northern Ireland government department responsible for environmental policy. I'm going to focus on just some key pollutants, particulate matter, and nitrogen dioxide. And we're really trying to answer the question here, if Northern Ireland had these air quality guidelines from the WHO implemented today, would we comply? So the first graph here just shows, the first bar chart just shows annual mean concentrations of PM10 from different monitoring sites in Northern Ireland. So these are mostly urban background sites. If you think about residential areas, and some are also roadside sites where there are lots and lots of traffic. As you can see, the existing statutory limit values and objectives are in blue, and the concentrations are well below these limit values, as we all could probably guess. In terms of the air quality guidelines for the annual mean for PM10, in the vast majority of these sites, Northern Ireland is actually in compliance. So we're below that threshold level, except in 2 different locations. You can see there hopefully you can see the names of the sites, Stockman's Lane and Newry Canal Street. These are both busy roads where there's lots of traffic. Next slide, please. And then if you look at PM 2.5, so this is, as Paul has mentioned, a pollutant of particular concern given the evidence, that the health evidence of its effects. And so again, Northern Ireland, in terms of these monitoring sites, is well within compliance with the existing limit values, but we're not in compliance with the air quality guidelines as recommended by the WHO in the vast majority of places. The only place where we are compliant is, you can see there, Loch Navar. Now this is a remote site. It's like a wooded area. There are no local sources of pollution. So this sort of relates to what Paul was saying, that even if you could deal with local emission sources, whichever way you could think of, you're still facing the problem of transboundary regional background concentrations, which pushes you close to that recommended guideline level. And so for PM 2.5, we're not compliant currently. Next slide, please. And then finally, another key pollutant that we're concerned about is nitrogen dioxide. This is typically something we're worried about in the urban environment where there's lots of road traffic. And again, we're compliant with limit values, although not to the same extent as the other pollutants that I've shown. And we're well above the recommended air quality guidelines in the majority of these locations here. And again, the only places where we're not compliant, we are compliant with the air quality guidelines is in 2 urban background sites, so residential areas where traffic isn't so much of a concern for pollution. Next slide, please. So overall, these data, and these are the latest published data in terms of these annual reports, show that Northern Ireland is largely not compliant with the air quality guidelines, at least for the annual means for NO2 and PM 2.5, but is mostly compliant for PM10. So we don't, and this is no surprise really, we don't meet the guidelines today. If you look at trends since 2020, the post-COVID period, which I think is a sensible starting point for thinking about recent trends, it suggests that, at least in Northern Ireland, pollution levels have been fairly stable and they haven't really fallen significantly. And that suggests that we're unlikely to meet the WHO guidelines in the near term, assuming that there are no interventions, assuming similar trends. So what then do we need to do in order to move towards improved air quality that's in line with the WHO guidelines? In other words, what are the key air quality challenges facing Northern Ireland? Next slide, please. So I'm just going to touch on three air quality challenges, which are to a large extent common to all parts of the UK, but maybe more of an issue in some parts than in others. And in Northern Ireland, we face the same problems with road traffic pollution in urban areas. In particular, in Northern Ireland, it's particularly heightened. There's evidence that Belfast is particularly congested. It's also a region with high levels of car dependency for a number of different reasons. And traffic is responsible for some of the Belfast City Council's particular air quality problems. that air quality management areas have been declared. The routes to compliance in terms of bringing those pollution levels down are, active travel, electric vehicles. It's not clear, for example, if things that have been implemented in other parts of the UK, such as low emission zones, it's not clear whether they would be applicable in Belfast to the same extent. But there's a number of things that would be required to reduce the urban NO2 problem. Next slide. Another problem, again, common to the other parts of the UK is solid fuel burning. In Northern Ireland, this is particularly problematic because, first of all, we have a greater share of the population that burns solid fuel to heat their homes, and a greater population actually burns coal to heat their homes. So we might think of policies that follow the Republic of Ireland, who have already several years ago banned the sale of household coal and wet wood, in shops across Ireland to stop people from being able to purchase and therefore burn it. Next slide. Again, related to what Paul has said, ammonia is also a particular problem in Northern Ireland because in our case, we have a relatively large agri-food sector. We are a disproportionate emitter of ammonia, so it's a particular problem for this part of the UK. And an ammonia strategy, which has been floated for a few years, is yet to be published, and that's something that could deal with that. We'd hope could deal with those problems. Next slide. And so, yeah, just to finally finish off, as I said, Northern Ireland doesn't yet have its own clean air strategy for Northern Ireland. I've got a bit of a timeline there, and you can see that the original steps towards this strategy were taken in 2020, just a number of years ago. So there's been a significant delay in developing and publishing this strategy. So it remains to be seen what interventions may be put in place to try and deal with those challenges. We're hoping this year we will see the next iteration of that strategy document come to fruition. Next slide. Yeah, so that's a summary of the perspective from Northern Ireland. So looking forward to the discussion to try and pick up on some of these issues.
Brilliant. Thank you, Neil. And yes, we all hope that Northern Ireland gets its clean air strategy soon. It seems a real shame to be the one nation of the UK that's dealing at the moment without having one. Okay, brilliant. So that means that we go on to our next speaker now for the Scottish perspective. We're going to go to Gareth Brown from Asthma UK. Gareth is also chair of Healthy Air Scotland, a coalition of organisations campaigning for clean air in Scotland. So Gareth, over to you.
Thank you, Livi, and thank you to Christopher and the Institute for the chance to speak and give our Scottish perspective on what we are doing within Asthma UK and also within the Healthier Scotland Coalition, which is independent of the Healthier Coalition that Livi mentioned earlier on. For Asthma UK, our focus on air pollution is part of our prevention strategy. We focus on tobacco and smoking as the other prevention area, but air pollution is one of the areas that has gained a lot of focus in the last couple of years. Part of the reason for that is the links with health, not just respiratory and air pollution. We also know that around 2,700 people die each year prematurely from air pollution related deaths. For the WHO guidelines, we have been doing some work in Scotland to try and push the Scottish Government to adopt these. I would also just add that back in 2021, the Scottish Government published its second Clean Air strategy, Clean Air for Scotland 2, and that's about to expire this year. When the WHO announced the new 2021 air quality guidelines, there were some parliamentary questions submitted to the Scottish Government very shortly after, And the Scottish Government said at the time in September 2021 that this is something that they would give consideration to, particularly through Clean Air for Scotland 2. We're almost at the end of Clean Air for Scotland 2. The next version of the strategy or framework is in the process of being put together. We are not part of that, so I can't speak on behalf of what the Scottish Government is planning to do at that point. But having been involved in a lot of the implementation around Clean Air for Scotland 3, we are aware that that's something they are looking at. They are very mindful, and it's come up a couple of times already today about the transboundary air pollution. So the Scottish Government are very mindful that even if they were to set the PM2.5 of 5 micrograms, that could be impacted by pollution from other jurisdictions. So they are very mindful of that. But again, I'm not speaking on behalf of the Scottish Government. Asthma UK in the last few years have published some reports. We mostly focus on transport and domestic burning when it comes to air pollution, partly because there's a lot of easier wins in there. And Professor Lewis touched earlier on that any action on mitigating the air quality from industry and agriculture is more complex and is more challenging. We are also in a period of an election right now, with the Scottish Parliament no longer sitting, and new MSPs will be elected on the 7th of May. So part of what we've been doing in Scotland is trying to get all the political parties to adopt better policies around air quality, and we're hoping that we can get some good wins post-election from that. Healthier Scotland, which I mentioned as well. We have about 13, 14 different organisations from respiratory, cardiovascular, and brain health, including active travel and environmental organisations, and a few academics as well. So we've been trying to push some policies on active travel, human rights and monitoring, as well as transport and domestic burning. Back in 2024, we did petition the Scottish Parliament to adopt the WHO guidelines, or put pressure on the Scottish Government to adopt the WHO guidelines. And I said earlier on about the example of the parliamentary questions that were submitted, and it's still unclear what's going to happen with the WHO guidelines being adopted in Scotland. Scotland, or particularly the Scottish Government, has always prided itself on being more progressive than other parts of the UK, and that's something we've always been good at, or we like to boast about being good at sometimes. But it still remains to be seen what's going to happen. Now, whether they do adopt the lower targets for PM2.5 and NO2, or they'll find some kind of common ground in between, is still unsure. But we do know that the Scottish Government's ambition is for Scotland to have the best air quality in Europe. So to achieve that, they are going to have to be bold. They are going to have to be, more radical. I think a lot of the easy options have been taken. We have low emission zones in Scotland, in Glasgow, Aberdeen, Dundee, and Edinburgh. Early data tells us that these are reducing NO2 limits in the boundaries within these 4 cities. But to have that ambition, it needs to be matched with strong actions from the Scottish Government. And as I said, a lot of the easy options have been taken. One thing that needs to be linked very strongly with the actions is improved and increasing monitoring in Scotland. That's something that's been reflected by the Scottish Government, and it's also been reflected by the Environmental Standards for Scotland as well, who put the Scottish Government on notice essentially, and they have reflected that there's been slow and incremental improvement in the air quality in Scotland, but part of that needs to be included within better monitoring sites in Scotland. Back in 2024, we published the Transport in Scotland report, and we did find that around a third of the monitoring stations in Scotland would meet the new PM2.5 levels, and about 2/3 would meet the new NO2 values. That's something we still need to work on, and that's something the Scottish Government really need to be stronger on again. Having that monitor network goes hand in hand with improving air quality. Most of the monitoring sites in Scotland are next to main roads. They don't often account for the rise in domestic burning that we've seen in previous years. So with that political will, we do have a couple of parties in Scotland that are trying to do that. But again, there's challenges within that. There's obviously the rise of populism and far-right politics, not just in Scotland and the UK, but across Europe. One party has committed to abolishing the low emission zones. We're also seeing a rise in public apathy. We can see that in our polling that we can, Asthma UK carry out every year. And we don't see much improvement in what people value the air quality in their local area or in primary schools. So that's something we really need to do. Public apathy is also pretty evident when in 2024 the Scottish Government brought in new home building standards, and partly because of a lot of misinformation. Those home building standards that would have banned biomass fuels such as wood burning and solid fuel burning, that was U-turned, and there was a lot of misinformation on why that was done. So these are some of the challenges that we have in Scotland just now. I won't go too much into again what the Scottish Government's planning to do with Clean Air for Scotland 3. We're not privy to that at the moment, but when they do bring that out, we do hope that that will show what they're planning, what actions they can do to bring Scotland into WHO guidelines. But what they need to do again is really put these targets in legislation and then improve the monitoring network that goes along with that, so we know exactly where things are going well and things are not going so well. I won't take up any more time, but I'm happy to answer questions at the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Gareth. That was really interesting. And that just leads us nicely time-wise onto our last panelist to give an overview presentation from their area, and that's Matt Browning from the Greater London Authority. Over to you, Matt.
Thanks, Livi. Hi, everyone. So yeah, I'm giving an overview from London's perspective, not the UK perspective, just talking about what we've done in London. Next slide, please. So improving London's air quality is a mayoral commitment. It's been a mayoral commitment for all of Sadiq's term. We've got a number of integrated policies that help us do this. So we've got a London Environment Strategy, the Health Inequality Strategy, the Mayor's Transport Strategy, and the London Plan. We know that obviously the WHO air quality guidelines, they provide the strongest health-based benchmark in terms of what we should be aiming towards. And Sadiq is committed to achieve the interim target of 10 micrograms of PM2.5 by 2030, and then to achieve the final guidelines as soon as possible. We've made significant progress in recent years bringing down pollutants, but we are still some distance from achieving the final air quality guideline levels. Next slide, please. So in the air quality team, we use the powers that we have to try to tackle pollution at source. So we've introduced the London-wide ULEZ, and this has improved nitrogen dioxide levels by nearly 50% in central London. We've got over 2,000 zero-emission capable buses, over 9,000 zero-emission capable taxis. We've introduced air quality positive and air quality neutral policies in the London Plan, and this ensures that development actively improves local air quality. We've also got over 400 kilometres of walking and cycling infrastructure, and 1/3 of the UK's EV infrastructure. And then we've also got the Mayor's Air Quality Fund, and this supports local action. It's a £27 million fund over a number of years now, supporting boroughs to take local action at a local level. And then we've also got the Breathe London network, which we recently committed to maintain and improve last year. Next slide, please. So I think the encouraging message here in a London context is that progress has been made. So if we look at the top two slides here, we've got 2016 nitrogen dioxide maps on the left, PM2.5 on the right, and then that's taken from the London Atmospheric Emissions Inventory, and then the maps below showing the London Atmospheric Emissions Inventory 2022 concentrations. So these demonstrate that sustained policy action can deliver measurable benefits. We've seen significant declines for the last decade in nitrogen dioxide and PM2.5. In 2024, we met the UK legal limits for NO2 for the first time. This means that we've got almost 10 million people now which are breathing cleaner air. We're seeing this meeting this legal limit as a waypoint. The stricter air quality guidelines remain the ultimate goal and something which we're committed to achieving. Next slide, please. So I think it's important here just to set out that although we have made lots of progress, achieving final guidelines is incredibly challenging, not just for London but for other cities as well and other nations. They're intentionally very ambitious because of the health impacts that occur from low levels of concentration. So they're significantly stricter than the current thresholds, which some cities are struggling to achieve. In London, we've shown that with the mayoral powers we have, especially over transport, we can drive down pollution and we can improve the concentrations, but there are other sources, particularly around non-transport sources, buildings, heating, constructions. We've got weaker powers, so there's less that we can do. We're seeing that non-exhaust emissions are also becoming harder to tackle, thinking tire and brake wear, especially with transition to electric vehicles. This is almost one of those unintended consequences, great for NO2, but you get then different components of PM2.5, which we need to address. And we're seeing that the exposure inequalities are still persistent. It's still an issue in London where those that don't drive the cars live near polluted roads and are exposed to pollution from those. Looking forward to some of the opportunities. I think it's clear that cities can play a critical role in piloting some of these measures. We demonstrated in London what we can do with the right powers and the right political will, and demonstrating this at quite a large scale. So, and this has been replicated across the UK and other areas of the world as well, especially through some C40 cities implementing zero emission zones and looking at other mitigation measures. So I think one of my key messages is, it's really key here that with political ambition and integrated policy development, we can make significant changes. There's also a key point here thinking about political awareness and behaviour change. It's a lot stronger now than it was a decade ago. We heard the Chief Medical Officer reference air quality in his 2024 report. There's a number of national campaigns in England. We've got Clean Air Day and more recently Clean Air Night, which is raising awareness about the impact of wood burning. Nationally, we know wood burning is a significant source of PM2.5 in London and an issue which we still continue to struggle with because we have limited powers in this area. But the kind of salience on the kind of public awareness of this has improved, but it does also need to continue improving. So I think we heard Stephen Holgate speaking recently about the need for a public awareness campaign to make sure that the public are aware of air quality more generally and aware of what they can do to either reduce their exposure and also to reduce their emissions. Next slide, please. So yeah, just a few final points. Just thinking about how we can continue driving forward to WHO. I think we need to continue to collaborate both at a national level with regulators, businesses, and neighbouring regions. We've heard that transboundary sources are an issue, and they can be more of an issue when we think about achieving the final air quality guidelines. We've shown our previous research that some of the transboundary sources of PM2.5 in London are actually close to that final air quality guideline level of 5 micrograms. So we're saying even if we removed every single pollutant from London in terms of PM2.5, there will be times where we still exceed because of the transboundary sources. So this, again, just highlights the need to continue working with partners, both nationally and internationally. We do this through our partnerships in C40 and the Breathe London, Breathe Cities. But that's a crucial element. Make sure we're continuing to network and share knowledge and collaborate with our partners. I think also that we've heard here, which is quite actually encouraging, that the direction of travel is quite clear. We know that the standards are very ambitious, but that is the ultimate destination we're looking towards, and over long-term cooperation we are going to move closer towards them. But achieving them does ultimately depend on that long-term commitment, multi-level governance, making sure that regardless of who's in power, regardless of the government at the time, there is still that push to continue working towards them. I think having the WHO set really ambitious targets has been really helpful for us, because we can always point to that as best in class health-based targets that we need to be working to. So yeah, lots of challenges, but there are lots of solutions, and I think opportunities like this to continue to engage with relevant people, just network, share knowledge is really crucial to continue to drive progress in this area.
Great. Thank you, Matt. So Matt was the last of our panelists speaking today, which excitingly leads us into the last section of the webinar, which is all about getting questions from everyone who is listening in today. I've seen some of them coming in the chat and in the Q&A function box. A final plea from me to add your questions to the question and answer section. I will keep my eye on the chat as well, but that just makes it a little bit easier for us to see what's being asked. So while people start getting their questions in, I just wanted to ask an opening question really to the panel, which is really up for grabs for whoever wants to answer it. And I think we've seen a little bit of this from some of the panelists. That if you had to say one thing in particular, one factor, what do you see as the greatest challenge in your area that you work, perhaps in your nation or region or the UK as a whole? What do you see as the greatest challenge in meeting those true World Health Organization targets? And if you have any personal views on how we might overcome that challenge, all the better. But yes, would anyone like to start us off with that one challenge in particular?
Yeah, I can go first if that's okay, Livy.
Great, thank you, Gareth.
Yeah, I think that the challenge is the political will. Although I spoke about what was done in the past, some of the solutions that have been done, particularly in Scotland, I genuinely think that there is an anxiety around particularly the Scottish Government when they're trying to meet economic targets, they're trying to improve productivity, and there is a worry, I think, with the Scottish Government just now that anything that kind of puts more pressure on industry and business is bad. So I think that's where maybe one of the biggest challenges come in. We spoke about the transboundary thing, so I think again, if they were to reduce it, it means they'd have to do more within Scotland to try and mitigate the transboundary pollution. But again, it gets down to political will. Although we have, the SNP in government, they are looking likely to be the next government again post 7th of May. So and even in their manifesto, they made no commitments around air pollution. I've done analysis of all the main parties in Scotland, and there was nothing on vehicle or transport emissions within their manifesto. So again, that goes back to the political will.
Thank you, Gareth. So political will, does anyone else want to come in on that question? Oh, Chiara.
Yes, thank you very much. Well, that's probably more from a EU perspective, but I don't think it's related just to EU. I think that so here the biggest challenge that we can see in improving standards and also the levels of air quality is not in the lack of knowledge. We know we have plenty of that and seen that. It's more the scale of the structural change that is required to get there. I mean, if we look at the gaps that we still have with the PM2.5 nitrous dioxide that I mentioned before, so this gap is still driven by systemic sources. So a few of the previous panelists also mentioned that in the UK, so transport and heating, agriculture. So the issue here, in order to achieve WHO targets, is more about transforming system rather than tightening such standards. I can make an example, for instance, about the energy sector. So at IEP, IEP EU, let's say, we worked a lot, and we're still working on how to improve air quality through the heating sector in cities and how to improve social acceptability of these measures. So we see how the heating sector is now kind of a major driver of air pollution, less air quality, let's say. But that's right in the intersection between climate and energy and air quality. So you see, it's not just targeting one thing, it's not just targeting one standard. It's a bigger picture. It's a way wider picture than just a quality one. And we need to have these systemic transformations in order to push towards the right direction, from my perspective.
Brilliant. Thank you, Chiara. And Paul, you've got your hand up to jump in there.
Yeah, it's just to add really what I think Gareth and Chiara have mentioned perhaps the greatest challenges. Political will, we'll come back to that in a second. Transboundary issue of sources for PM2.5, which is a clear problem for Wales. And also across sectors, as Chiara was saying, about what the sources of different pollutants as well. And the way I look, that for me is, it's almost that structural nature of emissions, isn't it? It's not just a technical challenge, it's a cross-policy challenge. And kind of linking that up to political will as well. I think in Wales, yes, we've got elections in a couple of weeks as well. Very recently, the political landscape and geography in Wales has changed compared to where it was maybe 3 years ago. We don't know what a government is going to be in a few weeks' time. And whereas up until very recently, we've had cross-party support for the Development of the Environment Act and policy going forward as well. That could change, in a matter of months as well. But yeah, we've seen, having gone through the process in Wales, that problem of the cross-sector challenges, like agriculture, transport, domestic combustion, etc. These are areas where change is more complex and slower as well, and I think that's a major hurdle for achieving WHO targets. I think we've tried it in Wales to build that framework, which doesn't assume immediate alignment with WHO guidelines, which does create that stage pathway supported by that ongoing review and evidence. But I think the challenge is more, how do we reach WHO guidelines? How do we keep moving towards it consistently and across these multiple sectors? But as Chiara said, we've got to change the its structure and infrastructure in Wales to be able to do that.
Thank you, Paul. And Matt, we'll go to you.
Thanks. Yeah, I think just to, again, echo what Chiara said there. I think it's kind of key to understand here there isn't any single policy lever now which can deliver all the reductions required. Political will is obviously still a big issue. Same with the powers that boroughs have in terms of the limited funding they have to deliver these, and also the limited powers they have, especially to tackle non-transport sources. And being kind of strung up and tied to these short-term funding cycles, it really does undermine long-term delivery. And thinking about how we can kind of overcome this and try to fix this moving forward, I think strong integration with air quality and climate policy really is key. We sometimes think about as air quality as an issue and climate change as an issue, but there's lots of co-benefits there, and it's key to make sure that when we're developing policies and programs, we're looking at both of them as an integrated system, not just trying to tackle one issue.
Thank you, Matt. Okay, so just another question, and drawing on some of them that we're seeing in the chat and in the question and answers function. I think you first talked about it, Paul, but it's really clear from your presentations today that while different nations and regions of the UK share so many of the same issues around meeting World Health Organization targets on air pollution, the context is very different in each nation, and the context that each government and elected representatives are working in. How can we, with that knowledge, how can we leverage some of the synergies between other relevant issues? I see that someone's written about energy efficiency in the chat, but also I know that, Paul, you were talking about agriculture in Wales, the opportunity, because perhaps there is less activity in the EU when it comes to talking about ammonia, in the World Health Organization guidelines as well. Maybe, are there opportunities for quick wins for each of the nations, given that differential context around sources, be that on ammonia, but also on any pollutants, really? So I suppose, can each of the nations be leveraging some of these either synergies out there in the policy environment, or the differential nature of the sources of air pollution? Would anyone like to answer that question? I don't want to pick on anyone, but I don't have to because Chris has put his hand up. Christopher, over to you.
Thanks. Yeah, a couple of really interesting points there about, yes, leveraging the crossover, and you mentioned agriculture. I think with agriculture, there are obvious crossovers with climate policy, because of the emissions there have impacts on those greenhouse gas emissions. There are also economic arguments. I mean, there've been interesting notes within the EAC inquiry that's going on at the moment about the ecological impacts of air pollution, and they're relevant to biodiversity, they're relevant to agricultural yields, which have economic impacts. And obviously there's a lot of crossover between ammonia and secondary pollutants, which include particulate matter, which then go and affect human health. So I think generally across the air pollution space, we need to be looking for where these major crossovers are happening, where these Venn diagrams are occurring, and joining the dots a little bit better. in terms of the way that we work campaigns together and the way that we formulate policy that's sort of addressing these cross-cutting multiple wins. And on the agricultural emissions, there are some quite easy management practices in terms of livestock and manure, management and storage and all this kind of stuff. There are lots of lessons from Europe on this as well, which we're IEEP at the moment, where we can learn from the EU on some of these policies, where there are some fairly easy wins, there are some fairly sort of minor changes that can take place that can have some quite big impacts. And another interesting area is where we have vehicle emissions that we've been concentrating so much on the exhaust emissions, and we've got those down now really well through low emission zones and other areas of policy like that. And then there are things that are building up in the background to do with the non-exhaust emissions, and we're starting to pay a bit of attention to that. And that's sort of becoming a rising issue, and that has a lot of crossover with other areas as well. So it's sort of this ongoing sort of movable feast of tracking what the major emissions are from each of these sources and how they're interacting with other areas all the time. And I think there are all kinds of different wins that we can revisit and really build on here.
Thank you, Christopher. A question in the chat from Nigel around sources of air pollution that we simply can't control, perhaps because they come from elsewhere. And he specifically referenced Saharan dust and how great an issue that is, or is it in the UK in terms of us meeting World Health Organization targets. Professor Paul Lewis, I wondered, as you were talking about transboundary air pollution, whether that might be something that I could come to you to give your thoughts on.
Yeah, I mentioned, Sahara sand, dust. One thing that took up a lot of time and debate within the Clean Air Advisory Panel in Wales when advising on PM 2.5 targets was transboundary sources. I mentioned earlier on, we are impacted by perhaps more nasty types of PM 2.5 species from burning, of course, from Northern Europe, in industrial areas in the Low Countries and beyond. And these are impactful on health. And we're going off on a tangent, just to jump back to perhaps what we're talking about, agriculture and other sectors as well. In Wales, what we've done is not, everyone talks about the impacts of pollutants on health, and we've hardly ever talked about the impact on biodiversity and our countryside, etc. One of the first things I did as chair was to give equal weight to the impact on biodiversity and health. So every time we meet, every discussion we have, we're talking about both health and biodiversity together. And I think that was a real step forward for us. But in terms of transboundary sources, yes, anything from combustion coming into Wales is going to be an issue. In terms of Saharan dust, if that sand, if those particles coming in aren't impactful on health, yes, we can't control it, but should we also be considering whether they should be accounted for? Yes, but should they be accounted for in a way that they're impacting our desire to get to 5 microns per cubic meter, say for PM 2.5 and World Health Organization guidelines, but in reality, they might not be impacting on our health or our biodiversity as well. So I think it's a bit more complex. Yes, there's PM 2.5 coming in from elsewhere, but how is that really impacting on our health and our biodiversity? And can we account for that? These are natural sources. Can you discount natural sources from what that target might be as well? Huge discussion we're having at the moment and have had, and I would imagine the other devolved nations are looking at this as well. But that's an important point.
Thank you, Paul. And I can see that Jenny Bates has put a question in the chat about nitrogen dioxide. So as Christopher said at the start, not long after the IEEP did its excellent research analysis on divergence on air pollution between the UK and the EU, the UK government announced that for England it would be bringing its target forward by 10 years to meet the PM 2.5 annual average. But some campaigners and experts rightly said, well, what's the difference going to be on nitrogen dioxide? And if we're planning to build towards the EU's interim and World Health Organization guidelines, how should we be doing that? Should individual cities and nations be making their own pledges to reach these goals? You know, whether or not that's possible will be very different depending on where you are in the UK. Does anyone have anything particularly in response to that around nitrogen dioxide that they'd like to say? No worries. I mean, we all know that it's a particular tricky issue. It's something we're going to need to go beyond the current policies that we have in place already to meet those World Health Organization guidelines. Yes, Matt, from the London perspective.
Yeah, I guess I can kind of get out this one a little bit by saying from a London city perspective, it's helpful having that national leadership and having a stricter target in legislation that we can then point towards and use that as rationale to kind of develop more work. You know, we've and Steve's been very strong on WHO from a PM 2.5 perspective. It would be more helpful if we have a strong kind of national kind of guidance and targets which we can filter down then, and it also supports us when we're talking to boroughs and others as well. It also feeds into devolution of powers part and allowing us to take more action at a local level.
Thank you, Matt. And of course, you know, part of why you're here today talking about the capital city is London's had some significant gains when it comes to the expansion of the ultra low emission zone. I'm sure pretty much everyone on this call knows about that. Um, do we have a sense from leadership in London that there is ambition to go further and faster on nitrogen dioxide than, you know, take its own path rather than just kind of stay at national levels and do what's coming down from the UK government?
It's a hard one to pin down. I think obviously the context is constantly changing and the politics are constantly changing. The focus from the Labour government has been on housing, so then obviously we've had to respond to that. So the focus in this third term as well, it's thinking more about how we can support the national government in that aim. So the focus of kind of trying to unlock housing has become a bigger priority in this term.
Great, thank you, Matt. And one further question. Do we see any, I mean, we talked before about particular sources and maybe some alignment and where particular nations and regions can go a bit further. Are we aware of, and I mean, I would love to hear them, I'm sure everyone on this webinar would, if you have them as campaigners, it's always useful to know about them. Can we foresee any quick wins for the devolved nations or even for city regional leaders where we think that perhaps some issues are being ignored, but perhaps representatives can be proactive and bring down air pollution in a way that's currently being missed? Matt, again.
Not very many easy wins left in large cities, but I think just showing some of London's success. Also, we know what we do in ULEZ. We've also shown we can do quite a lot in tackling non-road mobile machinery emissions. So we've got a low emission zone for non-road mobile machinery in London. We've set a policy there where we provided kind of a structured a planning kind of clause that boroughs can then use and put into their planning documentation so it can be implemented across London, and that's really helped to kind of set the standard in terms of the minimum emission standards required for construction vehicles and kit use in London. And we've got a clear roadmap out to, so that tightened in January 25, and the again there's a roadmap to 2035 and 2040 when we're expecting zero emission capable kit. So that's, and having kind of a long timeline like that has been really helpful in terms of engaging with industry when we're talking to the developers and manufacturers of this kit, so they know that what the long-term horizon is. They know that, okay, we're going to need to pour 20 million into investing in this, but it's going to be the only kit that's going to be allowed in London in 2 years time, 5 years time, so it's worth that initial investment. So we've made huge progress in that. It's been a real success. There's more work going into improving the register where we kind of record this information and then provide data and insights back to the boroughs. But I think that's a real key one which could be replicated in other areas of the UK, obviously, as well as as we know, ultra emission zones, zero emission zones to tackle some of the transport sources. But for a non-transport source, that's been a very successful one.
Thank you, Matt. Gareth, would you like to come in on that question?
Yeah, thanks, Livi. If I can give two very quick examples. On transport, there's been some discussion. I know Glasgow City Council have been looking at having almost kind of different parking charges depending on the size of your car and the emission levels as well. So there's something there we could look at. Over the weekend, Transform Scotland, another campaign kind of think tank, they have been talking about the problems of the size of cars. Obviously, they're getting bigger. SUVs are taking up more space. They're getting bigger, and the impact that they have in the city centres. Um, Transform Scotland said that in 2020, just 1 in 10 cars were sold were SUVs. It's now apparently two-thirds of cars are now SUVs that have been bought. So there's a lot of kind of campaign focus really about city centres and the size of cars that are going in. Although this is obviously an area that has a low emission zone. And the other one for I would say for Scotland, and I know Mandy put a comment in the chat as well on domestic burning. Um, Domestic burning in the central belt, there's a lot of easy wins to be had there. There are clean air, smoke control areas in Scotland. These need to be refreshed. These need to be updated. The guidance needs to be stronger from the Scottish Government on that. And that's something we hope that will come through Clean Air for Scotland 3 in the next framework or strategy. That they can look at that, but we have to recognise in Scotland, the law talked about domestic burning earlier on. There are parts of Scotland that still have to have access to domestic burning. So we haven't been calling for a ban in Scotland, and other parts of the UK have. We have to reflect that there's also cultural issues in domestic burning. For example, in parts of Scotland, some people have a cultural right to burn peat as a main source of heat. So we have to reflect on what the cultural problems are. But again, Central Belt would be an area there's an easy win in there. Most people do not need to be installing wood burners and wood stoves. They were also up against a very well-funded, pro-burning lobby. I think the one of the UK government departments gave the Stove Alliance an award for getting a U-turn on Scotland's home building standards a couple of years ago. So that's what we're up against. But yeah, easy wins. Looking at what type of cars are going to the city centre, not just around emissions, but the size of them as well, and domestic burning in the central belt.
Thank you, Gareth. Let's hear from Chiara and then Paul.
Thank you very much, Livi. So I'd agree with Matt being cautious with the term easy, let's say easy wins, but there are, of course, a few high but relatively low cost measures that could be implemented. So besides urban traffic management, has been mentioned right now, the low emission zones, of course, depending from place to place, area to area, where social acceptability might be there or not already. But there is something, for instance, about residential heating. So we still hear a lot about traffic in the transport sector, and yet we fail to pinpoint residential sector in it. And the beauty, let's put it this way, about residential heating is that you can convey these measures through the energy lens. So energy is really high in terms of priorities for sure in the EU in the current mandate, but also in the previous one. And I believe that in the UK too, given the current geopolitical dimensions, but also the effects that we've seen lately. So phasing out the most polluting solid fuels and improving energy efficiency at the same time can, of course, reduce PM 2.5, especially in winter. And at the same time, you have this pivotal, let's say, there's this very important connection, this nexus between air quality, climate, and energy, which can become energy security and energy strategic autonomy, let's say, that plays an important role, and it becomes also politically viable, let's put it this way. Of course, another way is to improve, or let's say to put better enforcement of existing rules on the table, because there are already many rules that are designed to go towards that way, and sometimes, and in some cases, the gap is not really in policy design, it's rather on the implementation. So it is in the end about doing the existing things better and perhaps faster.
Thank you. And Paul, over to you.
Yeah, thanks. I think there's a number of areas where even relatively modest interventions could have meaningful impacts collectively. But just to mention planning again, planning policy, surely it can't be that difficult to embed air quality considerations more kind of systematically into development decisions planning, which could really influence exposure reduction patterns, I think, quite quickly, without then, of course, requiring entirely new legislation as well. And the other one I just want to quickly mention as well is strategies for promoting awareness of air pollution. And just to mention our Environment Act again, because there was a commitment in Wales, we had a commitment by ministers to publish a promoting awareness of air pollution delivery plan. And that came out last month, a few weeks ago. And I chaired the working group for that. And it wasn't difficult to do. And that plan focuses on health and well-being, communities, which I want to mention, and young people as well. And we're going to see new training of healthcare professionals in the NHS, education materials in schools, but also there's going to be a real push for community champions across Wales. And these champions will not just liaise with people in their community, but also local authorities as well. And there's a will by local authorities for this to happen as well. So that's really encouraging. And then, hopefully that'll promote behavioural change by people. We're all the polluters, aren't we? If everyone just can reduces their pollution a little bit, it reduces exposure for everyone, isn't it? And and hopefully that will help us as well in trying to achieve WHO guidelines.
Thank you, Paul. And I'm struck by how many questions actually we've been having in the chat and the Q&A box about different forms of home heating. And I know that the different attendees have been asking different questions depending on interest, but talking about the whether there are any opportunities for the devolved nations in terms of the government's warm homes plan, talking about wider issues with peat burning in Scotland in terms of the environment, and I suppose as well how we heat our homes in different parts of the UK is so different, as I'm sure it is across the EU as well. I wondered maybe, Dr. Neil, maybe we could bring you in on one of the questions about opportunities with transitioning how people are heating homes, specifically in Northern Ireland. You mentioned in your presentation that so many homes are not on that gas grid in the way that us in cities in the UK might rely on it. Whether there is a possible opportunity now, given lots of the instability around the world and the issue that it's the knock-on implications for gas and oil prices, does this potentially create an opportunity for air pollution reduction in Northern Ireland? Because there's another reason for governments and authorities to want to make that transition to cleaner forms of heating.
Yeah, I think it's really challenging for a number of reasons. One is that a lot of things are kind of baked in already. So people have their existing heating systems that are very expensive to replace nowadays. In Northern Ireland, as you mentioned, we're lagging behind. We tend to have a lot of home heating oil used. We tend to have a lot of people burning coal and wood. So people still have stoves, fireplaces, and they're not going to want to stop using them anytime soon, in sort of my anecdotal experience. And I think, I think that whole environment is just it's very challenging. And in terms of the warm home strategy, for example, was mentioned, and I know there's been problems across the UK with retrofitting homes and problems with mold and damp associated with badly fitted insulation schemes. Overall, I just don't think the environment's very, very conducive towards supporting people to make those changes. So there's a lot of things to unpick there to try and support that transition. Of course, there's a big cost associated with providing grants to households, maybe to change the whole heating system in some cases. So I think it's very difficult, even despite the rise in the price of oil and gas. That's probably not a very optimistic tone, but I think it's realistic at the minute.
Thank you, Neil. Well, it's good to see the opportunities, but also be realistic about our ability to capture them and, make the air pollution reductions that we'd like to see. Christopher, I can see you've got your hand up. Ah, but I can't hear you. I don't know if that's the same for our other colleagues. I can't hear you now. Hmm. Unfortunately, I don't think it's just me. Otherwise, I'm basically talking over you. Okay, good to see some shakes of the head from fellow panelists. Given that we seem to have lost your your audio, I just wanted to say I'll take a minute to kind of wrap up at the end of the session as well. But were there any kind of last thoughts, brief thoughts that any of the panelists wanted to share based on some of the questions that have been coming in and the discussion that we've had today? Absolutely fine if not. It's been a good wide ranging one. Um, Okay, super. So I suppose all that leaves us is time for me to wrap up. And thank everyone, thanking all our panelists specifically for sharing your knowledge and expertise with us today. It's been really interesting to see how different pieces of the puzzle fit together when it comes to nations and regions of the UK, and then how we can reflect back to our kind of ultimate North Star of the World Health Organization guidelines, and also learn from what's going on in the EU, and keep an eye on any divergence between the UK and the EU. We've covered a lot of ground today, from home heating and possible opportunities and challenges in that regard. Something really for us to think of, I think, when we're getting out of English cities and we're thinking about the wider UK and the round, and some of the challenges we face in reducing air pollution, thinking about car dependence, thinking about how we can actualize some of those targets that the EU are putting in place and some of those structures, and bring them down to the UK as well to make sure we don't get left behind. Um, Lots of kind of opportunities and some really interesting ideas on quick wins from the panelists. Um, and Chris was just added something in the chat around domestic burning, and interesting new developments in terms of technology. It's clear, I know that this is something that Matt covered in his topic as well, that continued improvements in technology are really going to be something to keep a watch on in this area as well, because we know that we've come away already with technology improvements. But yes, wood burning stoves and burning in general is something to really keep an eye on in this area. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for coming along today. It's been a brilliant turnout. I hope you've all found it interesting. And just a reminder that the IEEP is going to be putting this webinar on its UK YouTube channel afterwards. If you want to send it to a colleague that you think might be interested but wasn't able to be here today, and I think there's a link in the newsletter that you can sign up to their in a link in the chat that you can sign up to their newsletter if you're interested in staying in touch on this topic, and seeing all of the exciting work that the IEP have coming up on air pollution. So thank you, everybody. Thanks for coming today, and thanks for having me, and see you all soon.